Alright, so the first tool we're going to look at is called the bandsaw. And the bandsaw is called that because it has a blade that is shaped like a long continuous band. So I'm going to open up this door and let you look inside the panel and see what that blade looks like. Don't do this yourself. This is the only time you need to do this if you are changing the blade. And we would have your lab technician do that for you. Alright, so in the upper part there's a wheel, and then down here is another wheel exactly like that. So it spins in this direction, so it's taking that saw blade down towards the table. And the only thing that's holding that blade on is the tension between these two wheels that's pulling it. So if the wheel gets bent this way or that way, it starts to come off. If it's too loose, it starts to fly off. And if the band should break, which happens sometimes, then you'll hear a loud banging noise and it'll come off that wheel. Alright, I'm going to put that back on. You should never ever operate it without this cover. Alright, so as you note, this particular bandsaw and every one that we have in our shop are meant for cutting wood or for plastic only. So they could be used for cutting brass or other non-ferrous metal such as aluminum, but you would need to put a special blade on there for really good results when you're doing that. And the same actually is true for plastic. There's probably a better blade for that, but if you're not going to do a whole lot of cutting and it's not that precise, then you can use plastic on the saw. They do make bandsaws for cutting ferrous metal like iron and steel, but we don't have those here, and if you try to use these, then you'll end up damaging the blade and maybe wearing out the saw. Alright, so the first thing that we have to do is come over here and adjust the height of our guard. So we should leave it in the down position when we're not using it, so it should be like that when you find it. And then you're going to go over to the back and loosen the screw, bring this up, and then bring it down. So you want to have about 1/8 of an inch of clearance between this bottom of this guard and the top of your material. Alright? So the idea is that you can't stick your hand in there, so you never can cut your whole hand off or your whole finger off. It'll just nick it a little bit, and then that'll cause your attention hopefully to it before anything happens. Alright, so for the bandsaw, it can be used for cutting curved lines, even circular lines, and it can also be used to cut straight lines. So it's very versatile in that way. This is called the miter gauge, and they're available for almost every tool in the shop. And what they are is a little guide, so you can feed things through there and it will become, it'll stay in a straight line. So just the same, you'd probably want to draw a line on there so you can follow it. And follow it all the way down. But for right now, we're just going to feed it through there without that. Now down here is the on and off switch. They're usually color coded so that the on switch is green and the off switch is red or sometimes black. I'm going to start this up right now. It's important that we do not try to grab that piece of wood until the machine has stopped completely. Alright, now I can take that out of the way. So, anything else we need to remember? You want to keep your hands away from the blade's cutting line. If you do not stick your hand into the saw blade, it cannot cut you. So keep them away. You want to be able to keep all the work firmly on the table. So work cannot be held up in the air like this or like that. It all has to be flat against this flat table. You cannot go backwards. So you want to avoid going backwards, or those wheels that I showed you, because they're the only thing holding that blade. If you go backwards, sometimes the wood can catch that blade and rip it right off the wheel, and then it'll come off and you'll have a bunch of noise and confusion going on. So try to go only forwards with the material. If the blade does break, make sure that you shut off the power and stand back and then call the technician or the instructor and let them know. All right. Now the other thing I want to talk about is something called release cuts. Release cuts are cuts that you make on the outside of a curve or a circle. So what those do is they make it possible for you to take a saw blade, which is essentially a flat thing, and allow it to go around a curve. The larger the blade, the more of these little release cuts are needed. Also, the smaller the circle, the more of these release cuts would be needed. So I'm just going to show you briefly how they work, and we'll go ahead and just cut this circle out. Let's see, maybe we'll do that from here for this one. I'm going to take this off for now. Alright, so this is the way to make a long cut where you have to come backwards, is you shut this off and then gently slide the piece out, rather than trying to make it go backwards while the saw is still running. When you should go backwards with the machine off really depends on the thickness of the material, how dense it is, and how straight the cut is. So if it's a wavy cut, you might have to turn it off even when the cut was a little bit shorter. And just for accuracy's sake, we like to cut on the outside of the line when we're using the bandsaw, and that's because the bandsaw doesn't make a really smooth cut. So the idea is that you're going to take the shape out and then sand up to your line for the final finish of it. Alright, so now I'm going to show you what happens to these release cuts. circle, notice that I was keeping my hands away from the blade and having to shift the position of my hands throughout this time of making this cut. Now, it's a bad idea to try to take something really small and put it through the bandsaw. If you need to do that for some reason, you can do several things. One is you can glue it onto a larger piece of wood and use that larger piece of wood as a handle. Okay, so let's say we have this tiny little piece that we want to cut on the bandsaw. Really, I would recommend you did it some other way, but for some reason you had to do it this way. So we're going to use a clamp, and for these I like to use these Jorgensen clamps because they're flat and square. So they stay on the table and they'll keep that piece flat and square. So we'll just put that piece in there and tighten the clamps and make sure that the clamp is clearing this guard so it doesn't bump up against it. So it can go under like that. Hold it like this. It's important not to hold on to the handles because the handles are the tightening device and you can loosen it while it's in the middle of the cut. So hold it right here, keeping your hands as far away as you can from the blade while the piece of wood's going through there. So the other thing that's good to know about the bandsaw is it has a device for taking the table and tilting it. So there might be times when you want to make an angled cut and you can go almost to 45 degrees pretty easily. If you are the first person using the saw that day, you might want to check and make sure that the last person put it back to being square. We can check that with a square. Place the square next to the blade. And then retighten the knobs. So if it needs to be really super accurate, you want to do that every time. And if it doesn't, then you don't have to worry so much. And of course, when you're finished, I'm going to leave that down there so that the next person must use the guard adjustment before they can feed their wood through there. All right, so we have 3 bandsaws in the shop. This is the largest one. And to start using that, we're going to first adjust the guard. There's a knob back here that loosens the guard and tightens it. So we want it to be loose, and then we have a crank here that raises it. We want to raise that again just to where it's 1/8 of an inch above the height of the material. Just enough to let the material slide freely through there. And then we want to tighten this knob. So all the bandsaws have some kind of a way to loosen and tighten the guard in the back, and then some kind of way of raising and lowering it. This one has a nice little crank that allows it to smoothly go up and down. All right. This large bandsaw has a very large flat blade on it, so it's really good for making straight lines. It's not so great for curves. You can make a big kind of broad curve, but not a tight little round curve. But it's really good for something called resawing, which is that you take the wood this direction and cut it this way. Even so, bandsaw has its limitations. You're going to want to be very careful about following the line, not forcing the wood, but keeping it against this ripping fence. The ripping fence adjusts by pulling the handle up and moving it back and forth. And then you'll take this line that's on the wood and line that up with the saw blade, and then lock it down by pushing down on it. Okay? Now this particular saw is a little tricky. You have to pull this out and then turn the green switch to turn it on. All right? Now the other thing that's useful to have for this and many other power tools is something called a push stick. The push stick keeps your hand away from the blade so that if you have to get close to it and you have to hold the wood really close to where the blade is for some reason, you have the stick to do that work instead of putting your hand there. So notice this stick is a little chewed up. Imagine if our hand would have been there. So instead we have the stick which gets sacrificed. Okay? So we're going to start this tool, and I'm going to use some goggles for this. Just because I don't want to get a bunch of dust in my eyes. Resawing is now I have two thinner boards. Alright, so that's the bandsaw.